Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I am making a chicken pot pie for my family. I'm going to start off by making the pie crust. I used the recipe from my mother's copy of Better Homes and Garden cookbook. Here is the recipe I will be using. It is the pastry for double crust pies. I will also show the recipe down below in case you guys have missed it. Time to get everything set up. You will start off with a large bowl to mix the pie crust in. I usually use this glass pie pan when I make my pot pies. Unfortunately, this pan will only feed my family one dinner and one work lunch for my husband. I love to cook, but I enjoy not having the obligation to cook every day. So it occurred to me if I use this larger casserole dish, that I can get several dinners out of this instead of only the one. So we're going to make a giant pot pie instead. I've never made one this large before, so hopefully everything turns out well. I figured we would need about 3 times the crust recipe I usually use. This is a pretty basic recipe for me, so I will not be using a recipe for the filling. I will just wing that one. The only recipe I use is for the pie crust, so we will triple this one. We're going to start off by adding 6 cups of flour into the bowl. I just used the measuring cup that comes with this container. I almost forgot how many cups I added, so it took me a second to figure that out. Next, we will add half a teaspoon of salt 3 times. I usually use butter with my pie crust, but everything has gotten so expensive, I'm trying to substitute for other options now. I figured I would try a shortening recipe this time. The recipe calls for 1/3 cup of shortening, and we will be doing that 3 times. Now we just hand mix the shortening into the flour using our hands until it forms a crumbly mixture. The recipe calls for 12 to 15 tablespoons of ice cold water. I just pour the water into the bowl until I get the consistency that I want. You want to be able to push the mixture together until it keeps its shape. Flour likes to stay at the bottom and not mix well with the water, so always try to get some of the water underneath to help mix that up. As you can see in the video, it has almost formed a massive dough, but still flakes away some. This is a good consistency. You can always add more water later if needed. Also, don't forget to grease the pan you are using like I almost did. I just used the leftover vegetable shortening that was in the measuring cup. I just placed a lid over the pie crust bowl and placed it in the fridge. To get the flaky crust, you want the butter or shortening to not melt completely into your flour mixture. You want little bits of whole fat in the mixture. Now we can start on our fillings. We're going to start off by cutting up chicken thighs into bite-sized pieces. I recommend using chicken thighs since it has a higher fat percentage versus chicken breast, but just use whatever you have in the fridge. I thawed out this chicken a little too much. It is easier to slice if it is still semi-frozen. I use about 1.5 pounds here. It was just what I had in the freezer that I was trying to use up. I always buy extra chicken at the store so I can freeze half of it later for meals. After you have the chicken all cut up, I just add enough water to cover the chicken and vegetables. Most recipe calls for chicken stock, but if you boil the chicken and vegetables, then you're basically making a cheap chicken stock. If you want more in-depth flavor, then I do recommend buying or making stock. I do have some already canned up, but I feel like it isn't needed in this recipe, and it tastes just fine without it. I try not to waste too much when I cook. I will probably add chicken bouillon into the stock later, just to add a little bit more flavor, since I do have it in my cabinet. I had to take a break from making lunch for a second. My husband just woke up and asked for a cup of coffee. We mostly only have Christmas cups, coffee cups for some odd reason. My husband loves Christmas stuff, so we have an abundance of Christmas stuff around the house. Alright, he has his coffee before getting ready for work, so we can go back to making lunch. We're going to dice up some onions next. My husband works second shift, so he sleeps until about 9 to 10 before getting up. Since he isn't here for dinners most days, I cook our large meal for lunch so he can enjoy it with us. On the days he is off, I cook the largest meals for dinner. This also helps me pack his lunch for that day, since he just takes the leftovers for that day for lunch. Since we are making such a big portion of pot pie, he should be set for a few days, so I can focus on other tasks besides cooking. I have some dehydrated celery that I processed a few weeks ago. I just added boiling water to them about an hour before I plan on using them. You just pour enough to cover over the celery. I usually saute the onions and celery in one pot before I add the chicken, but I forgot, so I'm just going to do that now in this smaller skillet. I just place about half a tablespoon of butter into the skillet until it melts. While we are waiting for it to melt, we are going to season our broth. I decided to use some chicken bouillon powder that I had in the cabinet. It isn't needed if you don't want to add it, or if you want a healthier version, that works too. I used about 3 tablespoons and then 3 tablespoons of garlic. Next, I used 1 tablespoon of pepper and 1 tablespoon of thyme. The last spice I used was 1 teaspoon of red pepper flakes. If you do not like any hotness, then I would leave this one out. My family loves it. I never measure when I use spices, I just wing it. The butter looks done, so we can start sauteing our onions and celery. The celery still had the water in it from where I needed to rehydrate the dehydrated celery. Don't pour this out. I added it into the broth for added flavor. Next, we will add the onions into the small pan until they're soft and translucent. It'll take about 10 minutes. If you plan better than I did this time, then you can just add them into your stock pot before adding your chicken and skip from having to wash another dish. While we are waiting for the onions to cook, I'm going to take this time to get my vegetables organized. I am using 1 can of green beans and 1 can of corn, along with a bag of frozen mixed vegetables. I never made a pie this size before, so I'm not sure how much veggies we will need. I usually just add 1 bag of frozen vegetables, but this won't be enough, so I'm going to add the can of vegetables to help give us more. The broth is coming together nicely and has a good color to it. The onions are almost done, so I'm going to add the celery into the pan to help not make them too soft. I will give it another 10 minutes to saute before adding the onions and celery into the broth. The onions and celery are done, so we're just going to dump them into the broth. We will add the rest of the veggies now. I am just going to dump the can of green beans, the can of corn, and the bag of mixed vegetables into the broth. I will let this simmer for another 10 minutes. I do recommend to let the broth simmer longer, but I am pressed to get this lunch done before 12 p.m. While the broth is simmering, I'm going to start rolling out the dough. We're going to pull our chilled pie crust out of the fridge and split the crust in half. That way we have enough to do the top and the bottom of the pie. I just dump some flour onto the counter to prevent the dough from sticking to the surface and start rolling out the dough until you have enough to fit the pan. I believe you want a 1/4 inch thickness to your pie crust. Use the pan as a guide if you're unsure if you rolled out enough, but I just go off look and feel when I roll it out. Once you get it to the right size, try to pull it away from the counter first to see if it is stuck. If it does stick, you will have to re-roll it. Thankfully, mine didn't stick the first time around. The trick I use to get the pie crust into the pan is place the pan as close to the rolled crust as you can, and then roll the dough onto the rolling pin like I am doing here. It doesn't have to be perfect for your family. Your family will love it either way, and pie crust is pretty forgiving. I didn't roll out my pie crust perfectly here, and that is okay. Just try to spread out the bad areas as much as you can. I had to take a mini break here. My daughter got hurt and she needed some cuddles, so I had to do this part one-handed for a few seconds. If you have a giant section in your dough that has a hole in it, you can press some extra dough into this spot. It doesn't have to look perfect, it just has to taste good. I just trimmed the top sections to be leveled with the pan and filled in some dough holes that were a little thin. The leftover dough, we just added the top section we laid aside earlier. My daughter decided she wanted to help with the crust and flour her hands in my container of flour that I forgot to re-baby proof. She was not very happy when I told her she was too little to help. Now that the bottom crust is good to go, we can finish up on our filling. I added too much water to start off with, so we will need to fix that, but first we need to taste and reseason. It was on the bland side, so I'm glad I took the time to taste it. I just added some more chicken bouillon and garlic, about another tablespoon each. I am sorry I don't use normal measuring systems. I just pour it in until it tastes good to me. There is many ways you can thicken up the broth here. I decided to make a creque roux using butter and flour. I just melted about a quarter stick of butter with a quarter cup of flour. You just want to cook this for a few minutes to get rid of the raw flour taste. I did add some milk into the mixture only because I like my pot pie on the creamy side, and it helps to get rid of the flour clumps before adding it into your broth. Another quick way to thicken up this broth is using potato flakes. Not only would it help to thicken it up, but you also get a bonus flavor of potatoes in the broth. Once the flour is mixed well into the milk, you want to pour this into the broth and let it simmer some. I should have doubled this flour mixture, but it was almost 12 o'clock and I still had to roll out the top crust and bake the pie. Hopefully it will thicken up more once it cools. Now you just pour the filling mixture into the bottom crust and try not to splatter it as much as I did here. The last step to making the pot pie is rolling out the top crust. We will do what we did the first time and flour the surface that you intend to roll the dough on. I don't have heat-proof countertops, so I'm going to move the pan closer to me, using the cloth as a barrier before rolling it out. I rolled out the top layer really quick here. My child was reminding me it was past lunchtime by whining at me non-stop at the kitchen gate. While I am rolling out this dough, I preheated the oven at 350 degrees. I have never made a pot pie this size, so I'm unsure what temperature to use, but 350 degrees worked out great. Now we're going to transport the dough the same way as we did before. It will be harder to fix mistakes here since the dough will get wet once it touches the filling. I was lucky that I rolled it out more accurately this time around. It was harder for the bottom crust since I had to take account of how deep the sides were for this pan. You just want to trim the sides to make it fit the pan well. I'm not good at making pretty borders on my pies, and I'm pressed for time, so I did not even worry about it here. Don't forget to add some steam marks onto the pan, or your filling could come out more towards the sides. I just placed some X's on each corner and baked it in a 350 degree preheated oven for 30 minutes. I forgot to film me pulling it out of the oven. I am sorry for that. Here is an image I did remember to take before slicing it open for my family, and it was delicious. The filling could have been thicker, but I sliced it open straight from the oven so I could get my toddler fed before her nap. It was the right consistency once it cooled fully though. Here is her plate. She got some pot pie and some banana bread that I made earlier. She loved both and ate all of her food. My family ate off this for 3 dinners and my husband had 3 work lunches, which was great for me since I got 3 days off from cooking dinners. This recipe is great if you just want a few days off from cooking like me, or if you have a group of people coming over. This would probably feed about 12 people and maybe a tad bit more. Thanks for joining me on this adventure of creating a semi-new dish. I had never made a pot pie this large before and it was fun. Please like and subscribe for more.